talking about what to talk about. And oddly enough, there's this election coming up. And so it seemed like talking about the election might be a sensible thing to do in light of the timing. So I agreed to do that, in part because my sense is that this election is generating a lot of unease and discomfort and a lot of nervousness and concern. And I understand that, and I share that. I've been involved in the political process in one way or another, working on campaigns, advising candidates, doing policy work for 40 years, over 40 years. And in that entire time, this is the first time I've ever actually been frightened by the prospect of an upcoming election. And I'm frightened because I think events in recent years and in recent months have suggested that our system is more fragile than I think many of us realized, and could, if we're not careful, decay into something that we don't recognize. And the central issue on the ballot on Tuesday, in my view, is what the future of our system is going to be. And in particular, what the future of a system of norms and values and beliefs that have underlay our political life together for my entire adult life will either be reinforced and restored or decay beyond recognition, giving us an opportunity to run a massive, scary social science experiment about what the future of our governing system will be if, in fact, this system of norms and beliefs is allowed to continue to decay in the way that it has for a long time, but especially so for the last 4 years. So why am I so worried about norms and their role in American politics and their role in the future of American politics? After all, lots of people say we're a government of laws, right? Our laws and our institutions protect us. And our laws and our institutions create a robust democracy in which we can all be confident that the will of the people will rule now and in the future. The problem is we're a nation of laws, but law alone isn't enough to save us. Laws work only because the letter of the law is complemented with a series of norms that encourage behavior in consonance with the spirit of the law. And as norms decay, and you're left only with the letter and not with the spirit, you end up in an extremely dangerous setting in which the laws themselves become fragile, hollow shells that can be exploited by sinful, fallen humanity, right? This is a notion that shouldn't be surprising to Christians. This is a central theme in much of our scripture. Jesus is forever berating the Pharisees for their observance of the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. Isaiah recounts God's dissatisfaction with Israelites whose observance of festivals and sacrifices with respect to the letter of the law conceals an absence of the spirit of the law in their hearts. The idea that a fallen humanity cannot be saved by the letter of the law without its spirit ought to be a familiar concept to every practicing Christian. And it's just as important in our political life together. And among the many sort of norms that create adherence to the spirit of the written laws of the United States government, two of these norms are particularly important in this moment. And they're the two that some of you may have encountered. Those of you who've read Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's How Democracies Die, a book that I commend to the attention of all. If you haven't seen it, they identify the two pivotal norms among many supporting American democracy as mutual toleration the belief that political opponents are not mortal enemies, they're simply people you disagree with, and institutional forbearance. The idea that no actor in American politics is going to push their advantage to the absolute limits of what institutions will permit, with no concern for the impact of this on others. These two norms have been decaying for a long time, right? Levitsky and Ziblatt take this all the way back to the civil rights movement. There are all sorts of debates in my profession in academic political science about what are the causes of norm decay and the associated polarization in American politics. We can talk about that in Q&A if you like. There are a variety of theories and views, but whereas it's been decaying for a long time, it's been in free fall for the last 4 years, right? I mean, Tammy raised some of these in her discussion of civil-military relations a couple of weeks ago. Others include things like deliberate encouragement of violence at political rallies, chants of lock her up, suggesting that it would be appropriate to imprison defeated political rivals in elections, use of the Justice Department to investigate political opponents, use of American foreign policy to extort allied governments into providing dirt on domestic political opposition. But what I want to do this morning is talk in a little bit of detail about 3 particular examples of norm decay in recent American political experience, going back before 2016, but especially after, because I think they're illustrative of the ways in which once norms start to go away, it creates a downward spiral that puts pressure on both sides to conduct a race to the bottom that can quickly leave us with nothing if we're not very careful. And the 3 examples I wanted to just spend a minute on are congressional oversight, Supreme Court nominations, and the electoral process. So if you'll indulge me for a moment. With respect to congressional oversight, a personal anecdote. In 2013, I was asked to testify before the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Afghanistan policy. What should the United States do to facilitate war termination and negotiations in the Afghan war, a topic I've talked about with this group from time to time. Every single Republican congressperson who showed up to that hearing had questions for me about Benghazi, right? This ostensible scandal in which a terrorist attack on the US Embassy in Benghazi, Libya, killed several American diplomats and created a crisis in US policy in the region, and in which Hillary Clinton was held to be responsible for this unfortunate outcome. You may be asking yourself, what in God's name does Benghazi have to do with Afghanistan? And the answer is nothing, absolutely nothing. Right? The spirit, the underlying norm, the purpose of congressional hearings is to generate information from people that somebody mistakenly believes might be an expert, to help the Congress deliberate as a check and balance on the behavior of the executive branch and its conduct of foreign policy. This is a fundamental constitutional function of the Congress. It's basic to the idea of checks and balances that underlie American democracy. And yet every single Republican at this hearing viewed this undertaking not as a way to generate information to engage in checks and balances, but as an opportunity they hoped to score some political oppositional points in an active political theater in a hearing that I regret to say wasn't even widely covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, C-SPAN, ABC, CNN, Fox, right? When they asked me to testify, right, this is not usually a national event. And yet, in this not exactly overwhelmingly heated political spotlight, every single Republican was ignoring the substantive purpose of this oversight activity and simply extorting the opportunity to try and get some more stuff on the record criticizing Benghazi. When a reasonable person, I perhaps overgenerously consider myself a reasonable person, can look at this and conclude that the underlying normative purpose of this enterprise has been subverted by one side in this hearing, people in the government then get tired of participating in this exercise. And what happened is the Obama administration gradually decided that all they're doing by sending government officials to these hearings is providing more opportunities for this anti-Benghazi grandstanding, and so they stopped sending people. And they started ignoring congressional requests for people to go testify. Then the Trump administration comes into office and concludes, we're not going to send anybody even when we get subpoenaed. Right? And so the administration starts defying congressional subpoenas for people to testify. And the result is we rapidly get the complete collapse of the congressional oversight function that generates ultimately an impeachment effort as the only way to try and get people on the record in testimony to enable the Congress to continue. And this spiral has now affected both parties. And it has essentially destroyed the Congress's ability to conduct oversight. So what about Supreme Court nominations? And this is, I suspect, a familiar tale to everyone involved, right? Mitch McConnell has the legal power, right? In the letter of the law, the legal power as Senate Majority Leader to determine the agenda of the Senate and decides when the Obama administration nominates Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court, that he is simply not going to allow the Senate to act on the argument that it's too close to the election and the people should get to decide who the Supreme Court is going to consist of. And therefore, Garland is denied a vote. Not up, not down, no attempt to make another appointment, no nothing. And then, of course, you get an analogous situation several years later with the nomination and recent confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, in which lots of Democrats believe that if we're going to observe some kind of norm of fairness, right, some kind of norm of institutional forbearance, right, we are not going to press what we are legally allowed to do to its absolute limit of brass knuckles power because of the effect it will have on the view of others, that was no longer being observed, right? The principle that was cited for why Garland couldn't get a vote was simply ignored this time around because McConnell had the power to do it and everything he did was legal, right? Everything McConnell did both times was consistent with the letter of the law, and as McConnell regularly reminds us, right, everything he did was legal, absolutely right. And the result is this norm of reciprocity and institutional forbearance is now largely gone. And what that then does is it creates enormous pressure on the next Democrat to occupy the White House, if there is one, to not lie back and take this and get abused, but to pack the court, right? If there's no apparent institutional forbearance going on here, right? If brass knuckles power to whatever the limit of the letter of the law allows is the way we're going to run American politics in the future, unilateral disarmament of one side just gets them steamrollered. And you just created a huge incentive if Biden gets elected to expand the size of the Supreme Court so as to denature what McConnell thought he was going to get away with. Yeah, and again, the result is a race to the bottom. If Biden does that, what happens if a Republican gets elected after Biden? Well, we get more court packing to create an even bigger court to denature whatever Biden did. And what happens is very soon the Supreme Court loses any capacity at all to act as any hint of a disinterested umpire that calls balls and strikes. It just becomes another extension of partisan political combat, and we will have destroyed the institution of the Supreme Court. And we're on the brink of it right now. So what about the third illustrative example, electoral process? Right, so in the hall of horrors that is Halloween and election season in America, this is arguably at the top of my personal list. So this is likely to be a close election, right? And it's likely to be a close election with a lot of mail-in ballots. There is a general expectation that the in-person voting on election day will favor the president. That will change over time as mail-in ballots come in and get counted that tend to be, that are very likely to favor Democrats because the president has been arguing so aggressively against mail-in voting. That's acted as a signal to his supporters that they shouldn't do it. They should instead vote in person. And so we're likely, almost certainly by some degree, to see an outcome on election day that becomes less Republican favorable over time afterwards. Maybe enough so that the election goes to Biden, maybe not, but there will almost certainly be movement in that direction. And what that creates is a tremendous incentive for the Republican Party to contest the validity of mail-in ballots, because it's widely understood that relative to the in-person vote, the mail-in vote is going to skew Democratic. And therefore, A, B, mail-in voting is more complicated. There are all sorts of ways that you can get it wrong. And whereas when you vote in person, the poll watchers and others will sometimes help you remedy small mistakes. That can't happen with mail-in votes. So there's going to be huge opportunity to contest mailed-in ballots. What happens if this process is pushed to its legal limit? If norms of fair play, norms of institutional forbearance are not observed, and if the president simply decides he's going to take advantage of all powers legally available to him, right? Not violating the law, not some coup d'etat, not chaining himself to the desk in the Oval Office, but just within the law uses the powers available to him to contest the election via contesting mail-in ballots. Well, he doesn't actually have to show that the majority of votes actually cast are in favor of him. All he actually has to do is run out the clock. If legal contestation over these ballots extends beyond December 8, US law requires states to certify slates of electors on what's called the safe harbor date in this year, December 8, 2020. And let's just take an example of no particular immediate interest to those assembled, the state of Pennsylvania, right? Let us imagine that in the state of Pennsylvania, there are a lot of mail-in ballots, and they are systematically contested by a small army of Republican lawyers descending on places like Carlisle, the Cumberland County seat, hooray for us. Good luck finding a parking space in Carlisle for at least a month after election day, because they're all going to be taken up by out-of-state attorneys. And it's rather unlikely that this process of the contestation of every single mailed-in ballot to see whether the signatures match, to see whether the secrecy envelope is in its proper place, to see whether the signature is on the signature line or not on a different line, to see whether everything that needs a witness has a witness, right? That every single ballot is going to be challenged this way. It's entirely plausible to imagine that the legal process of adjudicating all that is not complete on December 8. On December 8, the state of Pennsylvania has to certify a slate of electors. That slate of electors does not, by law, have to reflect the vote in the state of Pennsylvania. What happens on December 8 is the Pennsylvania legislature determines a slate of electors. And it is within their legal power, there is a Republican majority in the state Senate and the state House, it is in their legal power to certify any slate of electors they jolly well please. There is no law that says it has to reflect voting in the state of Pennsylvania. That's a norm, right? That's a belief, a value system that it should, but legally it doesn't have to. And at this point, it will be entirely possible to argue that we don't know what the state of Pennsylvania's voters said because it's still tied up in adjudication in the courts. So at this point, the legislature comes up with a slate of electors that favors the president. The governor, a Democrat, puts forth a rival slate of electors. And they both get sent to Washington. And then it's up to the US Congress to decide who are the electors from the state of Pennsylvania. You can easily imagine that this process is going to go to the Supreme Court. And when it goes to the Supreme Court, let's further just speculate and say that a group of Federalist Society justices who have a very expansive view of executive power, augmented by a Supreme Court justice that probably more than half of America views as illegitimate because of the skullduggery that McConnell engaged in within the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law, in getting Amy Coney Barrett onto the court instead of Merrick Garland. Let us now speculate that the Supreme Court rules in favor of the president and the Republican Party and declares the president reelected, even though the national popular vote almost certainly will favor Biden. And even though there's been no actual vote count in the state of Pennsylvania or other frontline states that shows that the president actually had more votes, even in states necessary to carry the Electoral College. It was, in fact, other officials who decided this, not the voters. If this happens, it's easy to imagine massive demonstrations nationwide, but especially in large cities, in which legions of angry Democrats turn out in the streets to contest what they view as an illegitimate theft of the election. And I would put a donut on the possibility that lots of them show up in Washington, D.C. and in Lafayette Square. This president is remarkably intolerant of large-scale demonstrations against his policies, much less against his reelection. How long will Donald Trump tolerate large-scale public street demonstrations by Democrats in Washington, in Philadelphia, in New York, in Detroit, in Baltimore, right, in large cities of America, before he calls in the military to clear the streets? When he calls in the military to clear the streets, it's plausible to suppose that the NORTHCOM commander, who's the central active duty regular Army military officer involved, will conclude that this is an illegal order because these people are engaged in mostly peaceful demonstrations that are reflective of their First Amendment rights, and I will not order the US Army to clear the streets of these people. The Secretary of Defense may agree with him, and if so, is likely to get fired and replaced with somebody who will do what the president wants. Let's imagine that that doesn't happen, and the Army says these are illegal orders. We are not allowed to follow illegal orders. We are not going to clear the streets of peaceful demonstrators exercising their First Amendment rights. And at that point, the president turns to other sources of armed force, of which there are many. As we saw in Lafayette Square, there's the Park Police, there's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, right? There are other policing agencies in the United States that can be brought out. Then there's the Proud Boys. Or there's the National Guard, right? The US National Guard, it turns out, has a very interesting series of letters of the law, not spirit, but letters of the law that shape their chain of command. The National Guard can be activated, brought into service under three different authorities. One is what's called state active duty, which is what you normally think of when you think of the National Guard, right? This is when a state governor acts as commander-in-chief of that state's National Guard, and usually they're brought out to do disaster relief and hurricanes and activities of that kind. Secondly, there's what's called Title X authority, in which the president becomes the commander-in-chief of the National Guard, and the National Guard is nationalized. When National Guard units get deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, this is the legal authority under which they're acting. And under that circumstance, they're just an extension of the regular active duty military. If the active duty military's orders are, do not clear the streets because it's illegal, the National Guard would have to stand down. Under state active duty, they don't leave the state. But then we have Title 32 authority. And under Title 32 authority for activation of the National Guard, they are paid by the federal government and they can be deployed anywhere, but they remain under the command of the state governor. So some of you are aware that National Guard forces were called to Washington in June and were participating in a relatively minor way in the infamous clearing of the streets of Washington in the uprisings over the killing of Black men by American police. That was under Title 32 authority. And what that enables the president to do is go army shopping. The president can go to Republican governors of deeply red states with Republican adjutant generals in the National Guard chain of command in that state and request their assistance in Washington or anywhere else to do whatever the president thinks is appropriate. And if the chain of command in that state thinks this is okay, away they go. You get all sorts of interesting scenarios if the army decides this is inappropriate. But a National Guard contingent acting under the chain of command of a Republican governor in a Republican state disagrees with. Man, it's not hard to create scary scenarios of chaos in the streets as this unfolds. And note that everything I just described is consistent with the letter of the law. Now let's throw in one more wingnut, right? Just because this has been too hopeful and optimistic a talk so far, right? My friends and colleagues who do cybersecurity have mostly been quite surprised that the Russians have done remarkably little to interfere with the election so far. The intelligence community believes they were up to their ears in 2016, but there have been no apparent break-ins of Democratic email accounts this year. No apparent selective leaks of embarrassing material, not very much activity by Russian troll farms. And a lot of the folks who do cyber are looking at this, scratching their head and wondering, are they just keeping their powder dry? And the scenario I've heard from several people in the cybersecurity field is they're hypothesizing that what the Russians want to do is they want to use their cyber capacity after election day, not before. And what they want to do is unveil active interference with American voting in at least a couple of jurisdictions. And the purpose of this is not necessarily to turn enough, to falsify enough ballots to throw the election to the president. The purpose of this is to create chaos. Because if a thing gets announced by the Russians or made known by the Russians that they had interfered with the election balloting software in Carbon County, Pennsylvania, and in 2 other counties in America, we then have the problem of we know what they corrupted, but we don't know what they didn't corrupt, and we don't know how many votes it actually affected. Without the Russian interference, how many Carbon County votes would have gone for Biden and would have gone for Trump? Now we wouldn't know. Moreover, we wouldn't know if the Cumberland County vote is legitimate. Part of the problem with cyber is you don't know what you don't know. When you have evidence that something's been corrupted, you now know that it's possible to corrupt this stuff, but it's very hard to establish what hasn't been corrupted. And it's easy to imagine the president weighing in and saying, cyber interference by a foreign government has undermined this vote count, and therefore we need state legislatures who are not made up of Russians to make this call. right? You can construct lots of scenarios of an extremely chaotic outcome in which the result of this election will not be viewed as legitimate by anybody who doesn't win. It won't be viewed as legitimate by Biden supporters if Trump wins. It won't be viewed as legitimate by Trump supporters if Biden wins. And the peaceful transition of power, the peaceful handover of power, is the most fundamental norm of institutional forbearance that underlies all of American political life. People have sometimes engaged in the speculation that Donald Trump just won't leave the White House, right? He'll just sit there and he'll have to be dragged out by the DC police. That is not the scenario to worry about. The scenario to worry about is that in a close election, enough sand is thrown in the gears that this gets thrown into a legal morass in which, without any concern for the spirit of the law, pursuing the letter of the law to its limits creates a situation in which the legitimacy of American government collapses. So the letter without the spirit leaves us in an extremely fragile environment. This is why norms are so important. This is why I've been so worried about the gradual decay of norms for years and the free fall of norms since 2016. If Trump is reelected, I think this is going to get a lot worse, because Trump's brand is he dispenses with this kind of trivial, restraint of minor people. He busts norms for the sake of authenticity, right? The continued process of that, in the event that this continues for 4 years, is extremely dangerous. But even if Biden is elected, this is an extremely dangerous moment. If Biden gets elected, he's going to be under tremendous pressure to retaliate, to pack the court, right? To do away with the filibuster, to prevent Republicans who will use the letter of the law, right, no institutional forbearance, to its utmost limit, and will simply bring the Senate to a grinding halt, even if Democrats control the body, by filibustering everything. We've seen this before, right? This was the McConnell strategy in the Senate in the Obama administration. So you get a huge amount of pressure on a putative President Biden to do away with the filibuster. You get a huge amount of pressure on a President Biden to admit the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico as new states, so as to change the balance in the Electoral College in the Senate, right? And what that does is, if Biden then gets replaced by a Republican later, there's more pressure to do even more of that. And this is what I mean by downward spirals. It gets you into what political scientists call a security dilemma environment, in which each side is so suspicious of the other that they take action that they view as self-defense. They take action that they view as necessary to preserve democracy, that spurs counteraction on the other side that the other side thinks is self-defense and the other side thinks is necessary to preserve democracy. And down and down and down you go, and before very long, you're left with nothing. Because of this process and because it's so dangerous, if Biden is elected, I hope he will resist all of these pressures. I hope he will act to restore norms of institutional forbearance and restore norms of mutual toleration in spite of a huge amount of anger. It will be hard to do. And again, in my view, the central issue on the ballot on Tuesday is this process. What's going to happen to these norms that are fundamentally essential for the preservation of our governing system? And for all of you who have not voted yet, I hope you do on Tuesday. And I hope that this is at least part of the decision calculus you bring to bear when you decide how to cast that ballot, as voters in a democracy and as Christians in a democracy who understand the importance of the spirit of the law as well as just the letter of the law. With that, I've talked longer than I probably should have. Why don't I throw it open to Q&A or whatever else David wants to do with the balance of our time. Good and gracious God, be with us as we turn to worship this morning, and be with us as we leave worship and enter into the world. Guide us with your will, empower us to act in accordance with your will, and to pursue the life and the guidance of your Son, Jesus Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.